Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board games for 6 players. Now, when you're getting to these higher player counts, 5, 6, and above, the challenge is finding games that accommodate these higher player counts and that work well without too much downtime in between player turns, without the gameplay suffering, for the game to feel competitive among all 6 players participating. Now, typically speaking, the games that accommodate for these higher player counts usually are party style games. And there are a few party games on this list today, but for the most part, these are tried and true board games that accommodate 6 players, or in some cases, even more. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 10 board game for 6 players, and that is Deception Murder in Hong Kong. And this is one of those games that can classify in the party style game, but this game here is a modern version of Clue, if you will. There is a murder that's taking place in Hong Kong, and players are trying to find out who did it, and one of the players around the table is guilty of the deed. Now, one player is taking on the role of the forensic scientist, and that player has to silently, without communicating, no words, really no body language to give things away, they have to silently communicate and give clues to their fellow investigators. And every player is an investigator in the game, including the murderer. And the murderer's trying to stay under the radar and kind of blend in with the crowd so that nobody knows that she or he is guilty. And basically, the forensic scientist is getting these different clue tiles, and they're using these bullet-shaped pieces, and each round they're choosing one clue on each tile that basically gives the investigators an idea as to who might be the culprit, because the forensic scientist knows exactly who committed the murder. Not only that, but each player is going to get a set of weapon cards and a set of these item cards. These are key evidence, as the game refers to it. So in this case, you got a ring and you've got a suit. And before the game begins, the murderer has to secretly pick one piece of key evidence and one weapon of choice and reveal it to the forensic scientist. So basically, when the forensic scientist is giving the clues, the forensic scientist wants the investigators to figure out not only who the murderer is, but what was their weapon of choice and what is the key evidence involved. Because if at the end of 3 rounds, the players cannot guess the exact combination of those 3 facts, the murderer, the weapon, and the key evidence, if they can't get all 3 of those things correctly, then the murderer gets away and they are free to go and they do not get caught, and then therefore they win the game, and the investigators and the forensic scientists have lost the game. So that is quite the challenge. When you play at higher player counts, even above 6, this game accommodates up to 12 players, then you can start introducing additional character roles like the accomplice and the secret undercover investigator. You try to throw in these roles that add additional elements of rules and nuance to the game, and it could be for a very fun experience. But even at a 6 player count, this game is very, very enjoyable. Therefore, it qualifies for this list, my number 10 6-player board game, Deception Murder in Hong Kong. Now we move on to my number 9 board game for 6 players, and that is Sheriff of Nottingham. And here I have the Merry Men expansion, because the base game actually only allows up to 5 players. It's with the Merry Men expansion that you can play up to 6 players. And what the Merry Men expansion does, it adds a second sheriff, if you will, or actually it has 2 deputies that basically work underneath the sheriff and basically take the role of the sheriff in the base game. In the base game, players are taking turns over the course of several rounds being a sheriff, the Sheriff of Nottingham. And all the other players are trying to smuggle in goods into town, into the marketplace, whether it be legal goods or contraband or what have you. And there's an element of bluffing taking place, because sometimes you want to cheat. Sometimes you want to break the law, because that if you get away with it, you'll be able to make a lot of money. But if you get caught by the sheriff, then the sheriff is going to charge you a penalty and you're going to have to pay the sheriff some money. So that's something that you want to time correctly. You want to know your sheriff. You obviously want to have the best poker face possible. If you do not have a good poker face, this is probably not the game for you. But what's so cool about this game is that there's a simple set collection taking place because you have these 4 different types of goods. You got bread, you got cheese, you got chicken, and you got apples. And at the end of the game, you're going to score not only for all the money you made throughout the course of the game, but you're also going to score for having the majorities in these particular sets. So that's something to factor in. But if you get caught with goods that you lied to the sheriff about, in particular contraband, illegal goods, then you're going to pay some very high penalties and you're probably going to lose lots of those points. Now, again, as I mentioned with the Merryman expansion, instead of that sheriff, each round, 2 of the 6 players are going to take on the role of the deputies, and they each get to make their own individual decisions as to whose bag they're going to check and who they're going to go allow to pass by. So that's something to factor in when you're playing 6 players, because even if you're able to dupe one of the 2 deputies, perhaps the second deputy might not necessarily fall for it. And that's something you have to factor in. Who are the 2 deputies? Because yes, one of them might be easy to fool, but you might know that the other one, not quite so much. So again, really adds an additional element of heightened tension and stress as you factor in all these decisions. My number 9 6-player board game, Sheriff of Nottingham with the Merryman expansion. Now we move on to my number 8 board game for 6 players, and that is Thunder Alley by GMT Games. And this is a race-themed game where players are taking on the role of a race team. So basically, each player is actually going to have a team of cars. So unlike some of these other racing games where you only control 1 car or maybe even 2, in this game, you might be controlling 3, 4, or 5, depending on the player count. I believe that in a 6-player game, I think you only control 3 cars. This game, by the way, accommodates all the way up to 7 players and can be played as few as 2. But 6, the game really starts to shine at a 6-player count because the board really gets tight. You got lots of different players to account for and interact with because you always have a similar amount of cars because, again, with the lower player counts, each player gets a larger team of cars, but you have less players, less individuals to consider. Who's going to cut you off, who's going to pass you, and things like that. Now, the cool thing about this game is that you score for each individual car's final placement in the race. So that's something to consider because even if you win the race, if the other cars on your team don't do so well, you might not necessarily win the game. So that's something to really, really factor in when you're strategizing. You might want to surrender first place if it means that some of your other cards are going to do better for it. Lots of cool things. Again, when you're playing at 5, 6, or 7 players, so many additional things to consider as far as what the other players are going to do. My number 8 6-player board game, Thunder Alley. And now we move on to my number 7 6-player board game, and that is a Game of Thrones, the Oathbreaker game. And this game here also, like Deception, Murder, Hong Kong, can qualify as a party style game. This game here accommodates anywhere from 5 to 8 players. I think 6 is where things start getting interesting. 5 is okay, it's playable, but at 6 players, things really start to get interesting because one player is going to take on the role of the king or the queen, and the other players are going to take on the role of the subjects to the king. And basically, they represent different houses who are at least pretending to be loyal to the king. And this is a 2-sided game where each player is going to take on one role. They're going to be a secret role. They're going to either be a loyalist, someone who's loyal to the crown, or they're going to be a conspirator, someone who is against the crown and trying to bring chaos to Westeros here. And basically you got this score track here, and you're going to have 2 different cubes going around the score track throughout the course of the game. One representing order, which is what the king wants, which is what all of his loyalists would want. And the other cube is going to represent the conspirator score, which is their chaos, how much chaos they contribute to Westeros. And basically, this is all happening undercover because each round you're going to have a few of these missions which represent different thematic aspects as far as the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. You got Feed Flea Bottom here. Here you got Mission to Bravos. And here you got Hunt the Bandits. So you have all of these different missions that correspond with different aspects of the story. As you can see, these are still shots from the actual TV show. And basically, each of these missions is going to require a particular symbol. So for this mission here, it's going to require crowns. Now, these skulls here actually represent failures. And each player is going to have a hand of 3 cards available to them. And they could play as many cards as they want on these missions in order to actually make them pass or fail. So if you want to get crowns, a mission with crowns, at the end of the round, you want there to be more crowns than there are skulls, and therefore the mission succeeds. And again, players are going to be placing all these cards face down. So the king is not necessarily going to know who played what, but at the end of the round, they're going to reveal the missions, count the symbols, and see who which mission passes and which missions fails. And the missions pass, it's going to contribute towards the order as far as the score is concerned. If the missions fail, it's going to contribute towards the chaos. Now, the cool thing about this game is that at the end of each round, the king is also going to make a prediction of a player who they think might be a loyalist or a conspirator. And at the end of the game, they're going to score points, additional points in the order track if they were able to successfully guess who the players would be. But if they fail at guessing, they're going to lose points, or the other team, the conspirators, are going to gain points for that. Really cool. My number 7 6-player board game, Game of Thrones Oathbreaker. Now we move on to my number 6 6-player board game, and that is Android Infiltration. And this game here has been out of print for some time now. It takes place within the Android universe from Fantasy Flight Games. It was designed by Donald X. Faccarino, and it accommodates anywhere from 2 to 6 players. The 2-player game I am not a big fan of because players have to control 2 characters, and I do not enjoy games, in particular competitive games, where players have to control multiple characters. At 3 or 4 players, the game is okay, but at 5 or 6 players is where it truly shines, because in this game, basically, players are taking on the role of hackers who are breaking into this building, and they're trying to steal data from this building. And the building is represented by a bunch of rooms which are depicted by these cards. And the cards start the game face down and aren't revealed until players enter that room. And when you reveal it, you're going to see the name of the room here. For example, you got the Neural Interface Workshop. You're going to see how much data the room has available for players to hack or to steal. And you're going to see a couple additional features that players have to interact with, like tech locks and interface and what have you. And each player is taking on the role of one of these criminals here, these cyber criminals, and they're trying to break in to this building. And again, as I mentioned, hack for this data. And players are playing their actions. They have a group of cards. You have some basic action cards that every player in the game has. Then you're going to have a few unique action cards according to your character. And then on top of all that, throughout the course of the game, you're going to be acquiring additional action cards that are going to further distinguish you from all the other players in the game. And these action cards are the bread and butter and determining when you're going to take a particular action, because each round we're going to go in turn order, but the starting player is going to change from round to round. So sometimes you're going to have to factor in the players ahead of you and think, what is it that they're going to choose? It's kind of like program action selection, because you might choose an action that may or may not be available to you come your turn because some of the other players already took it before you. For example, the collection of data. If there's only a certain amount of data tokens on the room you're on, and there's enough players ahead of you on this current turn to take all the data there, it's probably not a wise decision to choose to steal the data on that turn. You might be better off moving on to another room or taking another type of actions. Now, the really cool thing is that this game has a little bit of a press your luck feature, because there are 13 rooms in the game. And the deeper you go into the room, the more you are at risk, but the greater chance you have of collecting valuable data. So you want to factor that in, because as the game progresses, you're advancing the police track. There's a track in this game right here that tells you when the police are going to come. And after a certain level is reached, the police are going to come, which means the end of the game is over, and players are basically going to have one more round to escape the room. But typically speaking, you could only move one room at a time. So you want to time your escape at a good time, because if you wait too long, yes, you might have collected all this data, but you're going to get caught by the police, which means you're not even going to factor into the winning situation at the end of the game. Really cool. I like the game from a thematic perspective, and when you're playing at these higher player counts, you really feel the tension and you really feel the excitement. My number 6 player board game, Android Infiltration. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 favorite 6-player board games, starting with my number 5, which is Dice Town by Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Mablanc, and in particular with the Wild West expansion. The base game alone only accommodates up to 5 players, but when you throw in the Wild West expansion, now all of a sudden 6 players are in the mix. And I talk about this game a lot. It seems to make it onto a lot of my top 10 lists. I'm really a fan of this game. I find it to be such a charming experience. First of all, I'm a fan of the Wild West genre, but I'm also a fan of the mechanisms in this game. Basically, players are trying to control or gain the benefits in as many of these buildings throughout the course of Dice Town as possible, because that's how they're going to get their victory points. But every round, players are rolling their dice, which consists of poker face dice. So it's basically a game of poker. And you're taking your little bullet-shaped cup here, and you're shaking the dice, and you're flipping them over, and you're revealing them to yourself before you reveal them to your opponents, and you're choosing one die per roll, or per turn, you could say. So it's kind of like a roll and lock game. And you're choosing a die, and then you rinse, wash, and repeat. You roll the remaining die, choose one, and at this point, you kind of see what your other opponents are going for, and you kind of see your likelihood of winning at certain categories or at certain particular types. It's a little bit of set collection. You're trying to have the majority in either the hearts, the spades, the jacks, the queens, or the kings, or you're just trying to have the best poker hand overall in order to benefit from Town Hall. But there is a lot of dice mitigation. There are ways of using money as a currency to either re-roll dice without having to lock any of them, or in order to lock multiple dice at a time, because typically speaking, you can only lock one die at a time. But if you pay additional money, you might be able to lock a few more. Lots of really cool things going on in this game. Lots of ways of messing with your opponents, and particularly going to the saloon and being able to steal their property cards, which are very, very valuable. It's just such a fun experience. I like the concept of poker. I like the dice feeling to the game, the Yahtzee feel to the game, not to mention the Wild West expansion, which adds an additional benefit in each location, because in the 5-player game, it gets really tight because there's only one benefit in each location, and there's a chance that on a round, you might not win anything. You might not win at any location, and you're going to have to go to Dr. Bad Luck and basically get a consolation prize, which is not as cool as any of the other individual buildings. However, with the 6-player game, as I mentioned, the Wild West expansion, now you'll have 2 benefits in each location. So even if you're in second place at a particular location, you'll be able to take the benefit that the first place winner did not take, or that they left behind. Really cool. If you like Wild West, if you like dice rolling, this is a game that's a classic at this point, and you have to look into. My number 5 6-player board game, Dice Town. And now we move on to my number 4 6-player board game, and that is a Game of Thrones, the living card game. And I've been enjoying this game at a 6-player count. This is a tactical card game, competitive card game. It's not cooperative. Tactical, competitive card game. Very much like a lot of the competitive tactical card games in the Fantasy Flight living card game catalog. Very similar to games like Magic the Gathering. However, when you play it at a 6-player count, it becomes a different type of game, because it's no longer just simply tactics, simply reacting to what your opponents around the table are doing, because now you have 5 other people to consider. Here's the thing. Along with the aspect of card play that you're doing and the rotating of cards or tapping them in order to trigger their abilities and their attacks. Before each round begins, players are going to take on this little secret role selection where they're going to be drafting these cards that represent members of the Westeros Small Council. And you're doing it secretly, and each player is going to take turns drafting one of these secret roles. And based on your secret role, your role in the small council, not only is that going to determine a particular in-game benefit for you during that round. Perhaps you collect more money, or perhaps you have more strength, or what have you, for that particular round in which you control that character, that role. Not only does it give you that in-game benefit, but also it's going to encourage you to mess with a particular other small council member around the table. And again, it's not associated necessarily to the player, but to the role. So you might have had an alliance with that player on a previous round, but since they drew that role this turn, all of a sudden that alliance is forgotten. Also, you might want to mess with particular people, but these secret roles sometimes will prevent you from attacking other particular roles. So that is something to consider. It kind of becomes like a game of Citadels where you want to anticipate the role that you think your opponents are going to pick. Because if you're targeting a particular player, and that's the player you really want to mess with, you better make sure you get the right role card, because if you do not, you might not be able to attack them this turn. And I find that really balances the game and prevents players from picking on one another. It prevents players from bullying one or two players and eliminating them from the game so that they could play by themselves. Sometimes that can happen in games that don't allow for this, but I find that this little secret role selection really makes it so that you can't just say, you know what, I'm going to mess with you all game long. It can't just happen. It's not that black and white. Really cool. I like the cards. I like the theme. My number 4 6-player board game, A Game of Thrones, the card game. And now we'll move on to my number 3 6-player board game, and that is Seven Wonders. And I had to put this here. First of all, I'm a huge fan of Seven Wonders. It's a classic. It's an evergreen in our household. So many people that I play with really enjoy this game. And I find that this game, perhaps more than any other game here, is just so equally distributed along the player counts. And I'm not factoring in the 2-player count that the rules here recommend because of the variant. But at 3 to 7 players, this game is equally balanced. I'll admit that at the higher player counts, you probably want a larger table to play on, because the table space really starts to be a factor once you play at those higher player counts. But from a time perspective, the game is not too much longer at a 6 or 7 player count. Yes, you might have the occasional player who stalls the game here and there, makes the game last longer, but that could happen even at the smaller player counts. But 6 players is really cool in that sense. The challenge with a 6-player game is that there are people around the table that you're not going to be able to influence in any way, shape, or form. But at the end of the day, you only influence 2 people, your neighbor to your left and your neighbor to your right, no matter the player count. Such a classic game. I always play with the Leaders expansion, sometimes with the Cities expansion. Sometimes I even throw in the Babel modules from that expansion. Really fun, classic Civilization themed game with a pick and pass card drafting mechanism. My number 3 6-player board game, Seven Wonders. Now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 6-player board game is Shadows over Camelot. And this here is another game that accommodates all the way up to 7 players. And this is a cooperative game. I believe this is my only cooperative game on this entire list, because typically speaking, cooperative games either have smaller player counts, 4 or 5 players, or the games that do accommodate 6 or more players tend to be very long at those player counts. What I like about Shadows over Camelot is that it's not necessarily longer because you're playing more players. You as an individual might have fewer turns during the course of the game, but the game is not necessarily longer because the game is equally balanced throughout all the player counts. You're just simply trying to accomplish all these different missions around Camelot. And once you get to the higher player counts, the advantages is that you have more people to distribute among all of these different missions. So now all of a sudden, the game becomes a little bit easier, especially when you factor in that this game has the potential for a secret traitor. Very likely, one of your teammates is a traitor who's actually trying to make the team fail. However, when you get to the higher player counts, it becomes a little bit more balanced, because when you're playing 3, 4, or 5 players and one of you is a traitor, this game could be very brutal. But once you get to that 6th or 7th player, then all of a sudden you have a little bit more support. However, the opposite side of that, which does contribute to the fun factor, is that you have an additional person to suspect, right? So now there's an additional human being around that table that you got to look at and question and wonder where their loyalties lie. Really cool King Arthur theme game. Simplistic from a mechanism perspective. You're simply moving to a location which represents a quest, and you're laying down numbered cards that somehow contribute to the success of that quest. The social aspect and the variable player powers for each member of King Arthur and his round table, those are the things that really add an element of fun to this game. My number 2 6-player board game, Shadows over Camelot. And now we move on to my number 1 favorite board game at a 6-player count, and that is Cosmic Encounter, the space-themed, alien-themed negotiation game. And this game here, the base game comes with enough for 5 players, but once you buy some expansions, you can get all the way up to 8 players. And I'm going to say that 6 players, to me, is the optimal player count for this game. I feel like that is number 1. 5 and 7 are okay. 4 is playable. I'll play at 4 players. I'm not really enjoying it too much at 4 players. 3, which the game does range from 3 and up, I don't even play the game. I've never played a 3-player Cosmic Encounter game. I have no interest in it, honestly. It's when you have those bigger groups that this game starts to become exciting, and all the dynamics of the different alien races, the variable player powers, and how they interact with one another. That is such a neat aspect of the game, because you're looking at all of these different alien races, and each of them have serious advantages and disadvantages, and you're trying to exploit those disadvantages, and you're trying to gain benefit from those advantages, form proper alliances, and hopefully come out on top in this game. So much negotiation, so much teaming up, so many opportunities for betrayal in this game. Really cool. My number 1 6-player board game, Cosmic Encounter. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here with Harriman Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite game to play at a 6-player board game count. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.